In June 1942, an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the most brutal and significant battles of the entire Second World War. At Midway, the American and Japanese fronts clashed, staining the oceanic waters with blood and molten metal. After 3 days, nearly 3,500 people had perished in one of the most astonishing humiliations suffered by the Japanese Empire. In this installment of military history, we invite you to enter that hell wearing the uniform of the Japanese Navy, to understand how that battle unfolded from their perspective. Sunken aircraft carriers, downed ships, and thousands of lives extinguished. How was it possible? Today, we will find out. Before the Second World War, the Empire of Japan presented itself to the world as an invincible power. Japanese troops had defeated on several occasions the countries that would form the Allied bloc, thus demonstrating their tactical and material superiority. These victories allowed the small island to conquer Hong Kong, Shanghai, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and countless nearby territories. All this expansionist zeal was summarized in a concept created and promoted by imperial authorities, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Essentially, it represented the dream of creating a bloc similar to the Soviet Union, but with Asian nations that would be led by Japan to finally liberate themselves from European influence. From the Japanese island, they felt that their military superiority also translated into racial superiority. They believed that portion of the planet belonged to Japan by right, echoing the idea of Nazi living space. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Admiralty carried out an operation that changed history. That morning, Pearl Harbor was attacked by a number of bombers never before seen, turning the American base into a floating inferno. The images captured during that day circled the globe, and as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt described it, that would be a date which will live in infamy.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes. These pictures were made by a fearless cameraman who thought nothing of his personal safety to make possible this record for all posterity. A single lucky hit was responsible for the disaster that befell the Arizona when a Jap bomb falling directly through one of the battleship's funnels exploded in the engine room and set ablaze tons of fuel oil.
The Japanese attack was intended as a preemptive action to prevent the intervention of the United States Pacific Fleet in the military actions planned by the Empire of Japan in Southeast Asia. However, the attack that dragged the United States into World War II was only partially successful. The large American aircraft carriers were not anchored in port as the Japanese had hoped, so their effort failed to destroy Uncle Sam's maritime projection capability. From one of those legendary aircraft carriers, the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off on April 18, 1942, and bombed the city of Tokyo, causing panic among the population. In May of the same year, the Americans used their carriers to thwart Japanese movements towards Australia during the Battle of the Coral Sea. The powerful American response convinced Japanese high command that they needed to strike at enemy aircraft carriers if they wanted to continue dreaming of total conquest of Southeast Asia. Let's hear the words of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo.
帝国の流体、東亜の荒廃、まさにこの一戦にある。一億国民が一切を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。発行を家となす公募のもとに、この人中報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。
According to information provided by Japanese intelligence, the American aircraft carriers were sailing in waters near Midway Islands, an atoll located in the North Pacific, near the northwestern end of the Hawaiian archipelago. The name Midway refers to its geographical position. being halfway between America and Asia. With this in mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto proposed a risky theory. He believed that remaining on the defensive against a power with the industrial might and human resources of the United States would be suicidal. Therefore, he devised an offensive plan to be executed at this strategically valuable atoll. The concept was to cause such an impact that it would force the enemy to negotiate for peace, allowing Japan to retain the conquered lands. In mid-April 1942, the Japanese decided that their best option was to lure the American aircraft carriers to sink them all, and then take Midway with the aim of expanding their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. This operation was seen as preparation for invading Fiji and Samoa, as well as potentially advancing towards Hawaii. The occupation of the atoll, similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor, was not part of a campaign to conquer America, but rather aimed at eliminating the strategic power of the Americans in the Pacific Ocean. This would allow the Japanese a clear path to establish a significant sphere of political and economic influence in the region. Like all Japanese plans during World War II, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was complex and based on certain assumptions. Firstly, from the Japanese perspective, the only available aircraft carriers to defend Midway were the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. The USS Lexington had been sunk, and they believed the USS Yorktown had suffered serious structural damage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. However, after quick repairs at Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown was back in action, unbeknownst to the Japanese. Even more significant was what the Japanese assumed about American morale. Japanese high command was convinced that their rival was demoralized and unmotivated due to their frequent defeats in the preceding 6 months. Yamamoto felt that frustration could be crucial in luring the Americans into a trap, driven by a desire for revenge at any cost, thus definitively compromising their naval and air power in the Pacific Ocean. To achieve this, Yamamoto planned to disperse his forces so they could not be discovered before the battle, and then converge on the enemy with surprise and concentrated force once the confrontation began. As we mentioned earlier, it was a complex plan, but if successful, it would be a death sentence for the United States. The reality was that the Japanese were very confident, perhaps overly so to the point of overlooking some fundamental issues. For instance, capturing Midway required an unprecedented amphibious assault operation. Up to that point, the Japanese Navy had only conducted such attacks in undefended or lightly defended areas. The atoll was a small territory, so it was certain that there would be American presence across the entirety of Midway, further complicating the landing. And that wasn't the only obstacle. There were also natural challenges standing between Japan and its imperial dreams. The atoll is surrounded by vast coral reefs, which are a deadly trap for any unprepared amphibious vessel. Even at high tide, the water depth was barely enough for Asian boats to cross the reef without suffering structural damage. This meant that the invasion would largely have to be conducted by air, placing excessive importance on the imperial aircraft carriers. The success or utter failure of the mission depended entirely on the performance of these ships, which proved to be a fatal decision. Let's return to the final days of April 1942, when the Japanese Admiralty was preparing its strategy.
The problem with the Japanese was that they had scattered their fleet over a very wide area. It was organised into component parts, none of which could support each other. So, in effect, as a total number, the Japanese outnumbered the Americans, but when it came to a face-to-face battle, they didn't.
In order to deceive the enemy, Yamamoto dispersed his ships so that all remained hidden before the battle. His group of battleships and supporting cruisers followed Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's aircraft carriers several hundred kilometers away. Their mission was to approach and destroy any elements that could defend Midway after being weakened by attacks from the aircraft carriers. What the Admiral did not know was that this tactic would prevent him from properly defending his positions, ultimately giving the advantage to the enemy. Even worse, Something he could not have known was that American spies had managed to decipher the Japanese naval code and were able to translate several of their secret messages. But remember, today we will focus on the Japanese perspective of this legendary battle. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary maneuver, and the next day the Battle of Midway began. The Japanese fleet then headed towards Midway, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 433 combat aircraft. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 360 combat aircraft. These numbers serve to illustrate the magnitude of this confrontation in the far reaches of the Pacific. This is how Imperial pilot Harada Kaname remembered his experience before taking off.
ところがね、もう飛行機に乗ってみたらもうそこで海がすぐ近くで、果たしてこれは罹患できるかなというふうに思ったんですけども、もうそんなこと言ってる場合じゃないもんで、整備員にもしっかり捕まえてもらっていて、オーバーブーストまでやって、それで、走らせたらすぐもう脚を引っ込めの、操作をやりました。どうやら船から離れてザーッと進んでいって、これは落ちるかなと思ったら、それでもそこでフレークがついてどうやら上がりましたね。
The next day, in the early morning of June 4th, Japanese Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched a wave of 108 aircraft against Midway. At the same time, he deployed reconnaissance aircraft to locate the enemy fleet. Japanese Zero fighters managed to shoot down 17 American units that came out to confront them. Not a single Japanese aircraft was shot down. From that moment on, the Japanese bombed and strafed the atoll, destroying gasoline depots, seaplane hangars, observation towers, vehicles, and anti-aircraft artillery. Around 6:30 in the morning, Japanese aircraft carriers severely damaged the American base with a second wave of bombers. In the skies, aircraft from both sides fought fiercely, resulting in a large number of shootdowns and explosions. As minutes passed, Uncle Sam's pilots began to gain the upper hand and forced the withdrawal of large Japanese air units.
Japanese planes were shot down by the score. One flew slap into this.
Of the 108 Japanese aircraft used in this initial advance on Midway, 11 were destroyed, 14 suffered severe damage, and another 29 required repairs. With these figures, and considering that American bombers could still use parts of the base to refuel and return to attack, the first wave was considered a failure. It was crucial to intensify hostilities if they intended to establish a foothold for a large-scale landing in the following days. The Japanese officer in charge of the operation, Joichi Tomonaga, communicated to Admiral Nagumo that it was necessary to launch a second raid to complete the destruction of the base. In the first attack on Midway, he had opted to equip reserve aircraft with torpedoes, fearing they might encounter American ships. Therefore, conducting a second offensive was essential, as the atoll's airstrip had not been destroyed due to the lack of ground bombs. All aircraft in the second wave, including reserve planes, were ordered to be armed with bombs to destroy the island's facilities, an order that proved fatal. The major problem was that replacing torpedoes would take a long time, at least half an hour per aircraft. In the midst of this process, a lagging Japanese cruiser delivered Nagumo the worst possible news. 10 enemy ships were heading towards Midway. Consumed by panic, Nagumo ordered all aircraft to be brought back up to the deck and the bombs to be exchanged for torpedoes, further wasting time in a battle where the clock was the main antagonist. It was then that some American ships detected the Japanese aircraft carriers at their most vulnerable moment, when the deck was filled with planes loaded with torpedoes. If these were destroyed, the resulting explosions could be devastating and potentially sink them to the bottom of the Pacific. And so it happened. The explosion of Japanese aircraft armed with torpedoes also ignited the fuel depots, causing the 3 hit aircraft carriers to sink. It was a devastating blow for the Japanese. Once again, let's hear the words of Harada Kanami.
だから我々は見たところがその下張ってくるんですよ、雷撃隊ね。これを盛んに攻撃やってたんですよね。そしたら上そのドントリスが来てるわけです。それを知らないんですよね。だから向こうの魚雷は一発も当たってないはずです。ところがその時に上にドントリスが来てて、このドントリスにうまく命中させられてしまって、ああいう大悲劇を受けたわけですよね。
Imagine you are a Japanese sailor who has been educated for years in the Japanese doctrine of military and racial superiority. Before departing for Midway, your superiors described to you a master plan designed to send the enemy's main ships to the bottom of the ocean, one of the great Western powers. Everything is on your side: geography, surprise, and the number of ships. The problem is that when the moment of combat arrives, in the blink of an eye, hundreds of your comrades are killed. Thousands more are stranded. Your nation's maritime strength burns in flames on the waves of the Pacific. It is truly difficult to comprehend the shock felt by the Japanese troops in the face of such a crushing and unexpected defeat. Admiral Nagumo had to make difficult decisions during the days of the Battle of Midway. According to Japanese naval doctrine, large-scale and organized aerial attacks were favored over deploying small numbers of aircraft to defend or attack specific points. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy with the quantity and intensity of the attack. However, to achieve this, accurate information about the enemy's positions and movements was crucial. Otherwise, you would be sending a powerful fleet to its demise. Lacking such information, Nagumo chose the doctrinal approach and held back a reserve of aircraft on the carriers until he could organize a large-scale launch. Many argue that if he had deployed the available force, they could have potentially sunk some of Washington's carriers. Of course, these are just speculations. History has already been written, and this particular one had a clear victor. The Hiryu, the only intact Japanese aircraft carrier, launched its planes against the USS Yorktown, causing serious damage. However, shortly after, the Hiryu was attacked by bombers from the Enterprise, leaving it severely damaged and sinking the next day. Upon being informed of the loss of all 4 carriers, Admiral Yamamoto gave the order to withdraw. On June 6th, during that retreat, American aircraft bombed the cruiser Mikuma, which sank with 650 sailors on board. The campaign that had presumed Japan's victory ended in one of its worst humiliations.
Now putting to sea with a U.S. Navy cameraman, we see a new chapter just released of the great American naval victory at Midway, the attack on the carrier Yorktown. Filmed under fire, the battle that cost the Japs 10 warships, 4 carriers, and nearly 300 planes. Damaged by direct hits, the gallant Yorktown steams on. Her flight deck ablaze, the crew calmly fights the flames as gunners keep up their withering barrage of anti-aircraft fire.
The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including sailors and pilots. These pilots were the most skilled and experienced in the Japanese Air Force. There was no doubt. The United States not only won, but also demonstrated that it was stronger than ever and willing to fight to the end to avenge what happened at Pearl Harbor. The significance of the battle on that small atoll cannot be underestimated. It was a turning point in World War II, with many attributing Japan's defeat in the Pacific to this failure, a viewpoint supported by strong arguments. Losing 4 out of their 6 aircraft carriers left Japan unable to pursue further conquests in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. After Midway, Japan lost military initiative and adopted a defensive posture, which its admirals had diagnosed as a serious mistake. For the first time in the war, the number of Japanese and American ships was equalized, with the advantage that American industry could build new aircraft carriers more quickly. In fact, by 1945, Washington managed to launch 35 aircraft carriers, while the Japanese barely compensated for those lost at Midway.
America is building freighters by day and night. Red-hot rivets and red-hot rivet catchers are on the job. They're turning out the ships, and the ships are delivering the goods.
The production capacity was central to what happened in the rest of the War of the Pacific. The American industrial machine was gearing up in 1942, and its products really started to come out in mass numbers in 1943.
Analyzing Japan's defeat from the perspective of its admirals and soldiers, it's possible to identify a factor that condemned the empire throughout the conflict: overconfidence and limitless imperialistic vision. Every Japanese man was convinced that their nation could defeat any army on the planet. At the same time, there was blind faith in the complicated military strategies of their officers, which relied not only on the capability of their men, but also on luck. Relying on fate and fortune is not uncommon in wartime, but it should be the exception rather than the rule. Finally, the primary reason for Japan's failure was the lack of emphasis on intelligence work. Having a gigantic and well-prepared fleet is excellent, but it's useless if your soldiers operate with unconfirmed information and your messages are intercepted by the enemy. For all these reasons and more, the American victory at Midway remains a fascinating and pivotal chapter in World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a massive surprise air attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, dozens of American ships were ablaze, along with hundreds of their planes. Thus, the Empire of the Rising Sun began its ambitious and bloody campaign of conquest across the Pacific. This naval base was not Japan's only target. Almost simultaneously, all of the European colonies in Southeast Asia were besieged by brutal Japanese soldiers. The reason for this large-scale offensive was obvious. Only with a lightning attack could they seize all the resources necessary for final victory. If they failed, defeat would be the only fate that awaited them. Today, in this new episode of military history, we will tell you all about Japan's brutal initial campaigns during World War II and their terrible cost.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Historically, World War II began on September 1, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by German forces. However, some historians argue that the start of the war began a few years earlier. On July 7, 1937, after decades of tensions and minor clashes, Japan launched a massive invasion of China. Within months, many of its most important cities, such as Shanghai and Nanjing, fell into Japanese hands. Imperial soldiers, who regarded their enemies as subhumans, quickly committed terrible atrocities against civilians and captured prisoners of war. Although the conflict did not spread until 1939, all the major powers were watching these battles. Germany was allied with the Japanese Empire, while England and the United States had joint interests with China. Uncle Sam's nation feared that the Japanese would use their conquests as a springboard to expand into European colonies in Southeast Asia. It was not long before his suspicions were confirmed. By the end of 1940, the war had finally spread to Europe, with many of its great powers involved, although the Nazis had a clear advantage. France had fallen surprisingly quickly, and the British had been driven from the mainland to their island. The United States, for its part, had not yet decided to support its allies, reluctant to join a new armed conflict. Japan took advantage of the chaos to invade French bases in Indochina, knowing that it would hardly encounter any resistance. But although it did not suffer military setbacks, it did suffer in the economic field. the Americans decided to embargo the sale of oil to the Asian country. From one day to the next, the Japanese lost their main market, and their entire war industry was in danger. Hirohito, the emperor at the time, along with General Tojo and other Japanese leaders, now faced a stark choice: retreat to protect their reserves and use them to fight China, or conquer more territory and seize the oil by force.
The oil embargo in place, Japan develops a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, it's trying to negotiate a diplomatic solution and sends a representative to Washington to try to find a way out. And the emperor is generally trying to find a peaceful solution. But the military is also planning for an attack.
Knowing the humiliation that diplomatic means would bring, the Japanese opted for the second option, taking up arms. Their plan was extremely ambitious. They were to simultaneously attack the main Pacific Ocean territories controlled by the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. Only in this way, by taking all these colonies at once, could they achieve victory, since they knew that in a prolonged war, they had a great chance of losing. But despite the risks of the operation, the Japanese were confident. They saw their rivals as weak and cowardly, especially the Americans. They believed that if they were able to destroy their Pacific fleet, which was concentrated around the base of Pearl Harbor, they would be forced to ask for peace. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was entrusted with this mission. Under his command were 10 battleships, 10 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of the latest aircraft.
Against him, the US Pacific Fleet had 8 World War I vintage battleships and 2 carriers. Yamamoto planned the attack with great care. He would hit the US fleet in Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, since, according to intelligence reports, it usually spent the weekends in port.
This meant that the ships would be in port, where they would be easy prey for bombing. December 7th, 1941, was chosen as the fateful date for the offensive. To make the attack even more surprising, a Japanese delegation traveled to Washington a few days earlier to negotiate a possible Japanese withdrawal from Chinese territory. The Americans had no idea that one of the key moments of the entire Second World War would soon arrive. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave of aircraft took off from the aircraft carriers located just a few leagues from the base. Most of the soldiers and sailors stationed at Pearl Harbor were just beginning to wake up when the sirens began to sound. Just as Yamamoto had planned, they were taken completely by surprise.
Five US ships were hit immediately.
"21 ships were sunk, most of them unable to respond, and air bases were destroyed by bombs from Japanese planes. Within hours, the American naval port lay in ruins as fire devoured everything in its path. Before the defenders could mount a counteroffensive, the attackers retreated back into the open ocean, leaving behind only chaos and destruction.
It was all over in less than 2¼ hours. Yamamoto's plan had worked like a dream. Or had it?
The 2 American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor were not at the base at the time of the attack, so they were not damaged. Other ships that initially seemed to have been put out of action only suffered minor damage, and in just a couple of months could be back in the water. In addition, the opinion of the American public, which had been against the war, now turned completely in the opposite direction. Thousands took to the streets calling on then-President Franklin Roosevelt to join the Allies, and he did so the very next day. But as mentioned above, Pearl Harbor was not the only target of Yamamoto and his fleet. Almost simultaneously, the colonies of the European powers in Southeast Asia were invaded by Japanese soldiers, supported by their powerful air and naval forces.
It thought it had knocked out America. Now it moved against Britain and its colonies. The first to be hit was Malaya, where a Japanese force came ashore in the northeast of the country.
Malaya and Burma tried to resist the advance of the attackers, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the enemy. The Japanese's main mission was to conquer Singapore at the southern tip of Malaysia. This place served as one of the main British bases in the region, and whoever controlled it would have a great advantage over their opponents. The Europeans had turned Singapore into a fortress that they believed was impenetrable, but they made a grave mistake. They expected an attack by sea. The Japanese, however, had other plans. Even though approximately 30,000 Imperial soldiers were rapidly descending through the dense Malayan jungle, the British were calm. They saw the Japanese as disorganized and almost barbaric fighters. They maintained that the only reason for their victory at Pearl Harbor had been due to the element of surprise. But now that they knew they were coming, they would not stand a chance. Nevertheless, the enemy continued to advance. When they were close enough to the city, they began a brutal aerial bombardment of Singapore that destroyed much of its infrastructure. 2 British ships were moved towards the island to confront the attackers, but in less than 2 hours both had been destroyed, with thousands of sailors perishing in the waters of the Pacific. This defeat was the worst maritime disaster for the United Kingdom in the entire Second World War, but it would not be the last humiliation suffered on this battlefront. By January 11, 1942, almost all of Malaysia had been conquered. The British defenders, approximately 100,000 men, were at the base in Singapore awaiting the enemy attack. As mentioned before, the defenses of the fort had been designed for a naval invasion. The huge 15-inch guns, for example, were aimed directly at the sea. So when the final Japanese offensive was carried out on land, they were of no use in stopping them.
The Japanese launched an assault in early February. It was supported by more airstrikes. The British defense was soon reduced to chaos. Civilian casualties began to escalate.
For 4 days, the British tried to hold out as long as possible, seeking to inflict as many casualties on the enemy as possible. But reinforcements were never sent, and knowing that postponing the fighting would only mean more defenders dead, they eventually surrendered. More than 90,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war in what turned out to be the largest surrender of an English force in history. This defeat not only meant the loss of the important naval base at Singapore, but also marked the beginning of the collapse of the British Empire in Asia. Elsewhere on the continent, the Japanese continued to reap success after success. In the Philippines, an American colony, the Japanese had managed to eliminate American air bases through intense bombing. Without encountering any resistance, they were able to land on its shores in freedom. The defenders were quickly surrounded by the attackers and had to give up miles of territory. In just 10 days, Manila, their capital, had been captured. Uncle Sam's surviving soldiers were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, the last point of control in their hands. As with the British in Singapore, they sought to hold out as long as possible until their superiors sent reinforcements. And as their hopes were in vain. On April 3, 1942, a massive Japanese assault swept away the defenders, who had to surrender a week later. Before boarding the ship on which he was evacuated, General MacArthur, in charge of the American forces, declared, "I will return." With the fall of the Philippines, the only remaining Allied base in Asia was Burma. This English colony had held out a little longer than the others, but the final results were no different.
The British defenses had been utterly neglected. There were only some 15,000 men defending the country. They were no match for the Japanese. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance.
Like the rest of the bases on this continent, the equipment of the garrison was simply inferior to that of the Japanese. The 15,000 British in charge of resisting could do little to contain the Japanese offensive. In May 1942, the last remaining defenders in the country were finally driven out by the attackers. In just 6 months, the Japanese Empire had taken over almost the entire Pacific Ocean. The bases of the European and North American powers were in their hands, and everything seemed to indicate that this would continue. Yamamoto's plan for a lightning attack had worked perfectly, or at least that's what they thought. The reality was that, despite their numerous victories, they had not been able to achieve one of their main objectives. As previously stated, the American aircraft carriers had not been affected by the attack on Pearl Harbor, so the fleet had not been destroyed as the Japanese had wished. Furthermore, Uncle Sam's high industrial capacity meant that within a few months, he was already in a position to return the blows he had received. Knowing that victory was not yet assured with the territories won, the Japanese leaders decided to expand their conquests. Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands would serve as bases from which they could threaten Australia, one of their greatest rivals in the area. So that was where they sought to attack on May 3, 1942. The islands fell quickly, but the Americans had an ace up their sleeve. They had been able to decipher Japanese communications, and so they knew when and where the offensive would be to take the rest of the objectives. When the Japanese fleet entered the Coral Sea, in preparation for the invasion of Papua New Guinea, the American ships were waiting for it. The naval battles lasted 2 days before the Japanese withdrew. In practical terms, the battle was a draw, since both sides lost an aircraft carrier. But it was actually a major tactical victory for the Allies, as Australia was now out of imminent danger. The Japanese, however, did not sit idly by. Their next target was the Midway Islands near Hawaii. From there, they would be able to launch another devastating attack on Pearl Harbor that would this time put the fleet out of action once and for all. But they were not yet aware that the Americans could listen in and read all their communications. Once the objective of the next attack was clear, they planned a naval ambush against the Imperial Navy. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942. It is considered by many to be the turning point of the entire theater of operations in the Pacific. Both sides decided to risk everything, moving most of their aircraft carriers into combat. Hundreds of ships and planes faced each other for 3 days in the blue waters around the islands. For a moment, it seemed that the Japanese, led by Admiral Nagumo, had gained the upper hand, as the antiquated American planes were unable to damage their ships. But while the Japanese fought off the fighters, American bombers, which had remained out of radar range, swooped down from high altitudes.
US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on these ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American air power. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink.
The destruction was total. All 4 Imperial aircraft carriers were reduced to ashes by bombs, and the loss of more than 300 aircraft and approximately 2,000 men was added. The United States, for its part, lost only 1 of these ships. After Midway, Japan was deprived of its naval power. For the duration of the war, it was never again able to threaten the Allies. It was now completely on the defensive, while the Americans prepared their massive counterattack.
Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pile. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing.
But the Japanese were still far from being defeated. In land battles, they had not yet known defeat. Seeing their plans for maritime conquest faded, they decided to strengthen their position on the mainland. That was why they once again focused on the region of Papua New Guinea, in addition to strengthening their bases in the Solomon Islands. As mentioned, from there they could threaten the cities of Australia by air. But unlike previous campaigns, they would now face serious difficulties. The defenders had learned to fight in the dense jungles of the Pacific, and Japanese supplies remained scarce. In addition, Allied naval superiority meant that reinforcements brought by sea frequently ended in disaster, with most of the soldiers drowned or captured. One of the most important Solomon Islands for the Japanese was Guadalcanal. There, the Imperials had built an airfield from which they could attack the maritime convoys that supplied the Americans. Knowing that the Americans were preparing to invade, the Imperials strengthened their defenses. This next battle would determine their final victory or defeat. The Allies landed on the island on August 7, 1942. At first, they met no resistance. The Japanese let them settle in peace for the first day, but if the Americans thought that meant they were ready to surrender, they were very much mistaken. During the night, a naval force destroyed the American ships on the coast. The few ships that remained had to flee. The Allies now found themselves completely isolated in the jungle. But the Japanese were not able to take advantage of their situation. They decided to retreat inland to strengthen their position, but this allowed the Allies to take the airfield for themselves. Thus, the Imperial soldiers were deprived of their airbase, from which they could stop the arrival of enemy reinforcements. The Japanese situation had become desperate.
It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath.
During these campaigns, the Japanese began to use the dreaded tactic of suicide attacks. Hundreds or thousands of Imperial soldiers would rush toward the Americans, firing their rifles or brandishing their swords. But the well-positioned defenders would often mow them down with their machine guns. Japanese officers did not resort to this strategy for the results, but rather as a way to safeguard their honor. They preferred death in combat to surrender or fall victim to the hunger or disease that often plagued these islands. The battles on Guadalcanal lasted for months, but the chances of Imperial victory were never great. By early 1943, both sides were extremely exhausted. Neither had been able to bring fresh soldiers to the front. But in late January of that year, American ships were able to bring in reinforcements that replaced the exhausted combatants. With this new push, the Allies began another offensive. The Japanese, almost out of ammunition, medicine, and food, were unable to cope. Of the approximately 35,000 Japanese soldiers on the island in mid-1942, it is believed that only 1,000 survived.
By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed.
There were still dozens of islands in Japanese hands, as well as much of Southeast Asia, but it was only a matter of time before their fall. The objective of the Blitzkrieg to seize the precious resources necessary for the operation of their war machine had failed, and with it, the chances of victory. In Guadalcanal, almost 3 years before Japan's final surrender, their fate had been sealed. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think the Japanese should have done differently during their Pacific campaign? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.